Thank you very much for those kind introductions, and thanks to all of you for coming to a discussion of a really important and timely topic. It's a particular pleasure for me to be here because I've had the honor to work with Chris in many incarnations over time. He has served 4 tours in Afghanistan and was a strategic advisor to me and the whole interagency process when President Obama began our strategic review of Afghanistan. He later was forward deployed to work with General McChrystal and then back for more punishment to Washington and to more hours in the windowless room trying to improve U.S. policy. But I was really pleased to see that he and his co-authors chose to do this work. After more than 15 years of war, there's still far too little reflection on what the lessons we should be learning from these experiences are, particularly at the strategic level. The U.S. military has a very well-defined, well-honed tradition of capturing tactical and operational lessons learned, and those get filed away in files somewhere and hopefully influence future doctrine and training. But at the strategic level, I think we as a nation too often forget to pause and reflect and digest and learn from what we've experienced. We tend to move on to the next thing. And so I applaud you for trying to step back and capture this set of lessons at this point in time. I'd also applaud you all for going the next step. Too often we stop at the insight, but we don't then say, okay, so what? So what do we do differently? And this report is full of very practical, pragmatic, concrete recommendations on everything from policy guidance to mechanisms for data collection and analysis to how we should train and advise allies and partners in the field. So it gets very concrete and very specific, and I think that will make it much more impactful as a piece of work. And the last thing I'll highlight before turning it over to Chris to walk you through the details is I appreciate that the scope goes beyond just U.S. operations and recognizes that in this era of counterinsurgency and counterterrorism, so much of our work will be by, with, and through partners. And how our partners behave and whether they take care to avoid civilian harm and civilian casualties will not only impact their performance and effectiveness and reputations and legitimacy, but also because they're our partners, it will reflect back on us. And so we have a strong interest in ensuring that not only U.S. forces understand the lessons in this report, but the partners that we will work by, with, and through also fully understand and apply these lessons. And so I think that's a really important set of insights that we should highlight as well. So again, kudos to all 3 of you, and I'll turn it over to Chris to walk you through the report in more detail.
Well, Michele, thank you very much for the introduction to the report and your remarks, and also to USIP for hosting this event. 9 years ago today, I was commanding U.S. forces in Kunar, Nuristan province. In fact, Harlan Kafalis was one of my soldiers there, one of my non-commissioned officers during that period of time. And we were engaged in the summer of 2007 in a number of major firefights. And through those series of firefights in the summer of 2007, 4 of our soldiers were killed and scores wounded. And as we began looking at, okay, why are we facing the kind of threat that we're facing? Why is there an insurgency in this area? What's going on behind the scenes? The more we dug into this issue, the more we realized that this issue of civilian harm was a critical catalyst. And what had happened was an individual who had a blood feud against a locally significant, a local community leader, had manipulated intelligence to U.S. forces in the past to dupe them into targeting this individual. So this individual, faced with a choice whether to surrender and go to jail or fight back, chose to fight back. And in that particular area, the entire community went with him. And part of the reason why they went with him is because of his personal credibility. But also through that time, there were also a lot of civilian casualties, as well as harm to the family and community well-being. As we began to look at this issue through Afghan eyes and to see the effects of U.S. military actions, our actions on the Afghan population, when a husband is killed, the family breadwinner is removed, and the rest of that family is either impoverished or needs to rely on others for support. The damage that these challenges, these casualties, and this disruption to community life and family life begin to have on the wider community becomes significant, and these had accumulated to the point at which you had essentially a public insurrection in this particular area in the summer of 2007, and that was our turn to fight it. So I began to learn from that experience. First of all, the importance of understanding the environment that we're operating in, understanding the people, understanding the political, social, and economic dynamics, as well as learning to see ourselves and our actions through Afghan eyes. And through that process, we began to learn how to apply military force and other capabilities in ways that were far more productive to achieving our aims. And I also learned from that experience that civilian harm is broader than this issue of just civilian casualties. Civilian harm, as I defined it, the adverse effects of military operations on community and family life. And I have to emphasize, and so by 2009, after that experience and after coming to work for Michele, I began to see that this was actually a wider problem, that this was a systemic problem across Afghanistan. And not only was it targeting due to this sort of manipulated intelligence oftentimes, but also predatory behavior on the part of warlords and Afghan militias, particularly in the 2001 to 2009 years, had a significant impact on the Afghan population and the direction of this war. So by 2009, as we were looking at how to change the strategy in Afghanistan, and as General McChrystal began to look at how to implement the president's new guidance, civilian protection became a critical part of that. I do want to emphasize that there is no military engaged in combat operations in a foreign country that has taken better care of civilians than as ISAF post-2009. And I think it's critically important to recognize, as Michele highlighted, that the levels of care that the U.S. military undertakes to protect civilians and to prevent civilian harm is absolutely extraordinary. And what we're looking at in this report is civilian harm oftentimes that is caused, even when we're operating within the law of armed conflict, can have major strategic consequences. So for our study, we interviewed over 60 experts, scholars, current and former policymakers and military officials, to include former President Hamid Karzai, former Afghan ministers of defense and interior, two commanders of ISAF, Generals Petraeus and Allen, as well as many former and current U.S. and Afghan commanders, and a wide range of academic literature and sources. And we found that when we looked at this issue of strategic impact, and we looked at insurgencies and counterinsurgencies broadly, that when an insurgency tends to be successful when it gains tangible internal and external support. And civilian harm in Afghanistan was advancing the prospects, was essentially mobilizing people towards the insurgency in very damaging ways. And secondly, in these sort of historical studies, that a host nation that loses legitimacy tends to be unsuccessful. And civilian harm was undermining, damaging the legitimacy of the international mission and the Afghan government and creating major rifts in the U.S.-Afghan relationship. So civilian harm in terms of its strategic impact in Afghanistan from 2001 to 2008 was accelerating both problems, helping the insurgency become sustainable, undermining the legitimacy of the Afghan government and the international mission. So it was like burning a candle at both ends with a blowtorch. And it became absolutely critical to change that. And General McChrystal was the first one to really make this strategic connection between civilian protection and battlefield success. And that's reflected in his assessment and his counterinsurgency guidance, and began a process of reforms. And that's when I first met Rachel, when General McChrystal in 2009 asked me to look at this issue. I met with people like Rachel Reed and representatives from Civilians in Conflict and others. And that began a series of reforms that unfolded over time that had significant impact. And I just have to say, as a plug for Rachel, her efforts have literally saved hundreds, perhaps thousands of Afghan lives. So it's an honor to have done this report with you, and I'd like to turn it over to you now.